The world did not see him coming, and when it finally did, it was already too late. In a land where the sky seems endless and the wind cuts the skin like invisible blades, a boy was born destined to belong to no one. He was not born in a palace. He did not inherit an army. He had no teachers, no protection, no name that inspired respect. He had only cold, hunger, and fear. The steppes do not forgive the weak, and childhood does not exist there. His father was a minor leader, respected only enough to be hated. One day he left and never returned. The poison did its work quickly. To the tribe, the family of the dead man became a useless burden. They were expelled without ceremony, without food, without weapons, as if they had never existed. The boy learned early that abandonment hurts more than violence. His mother struggled to keep them alive, but even she knew the truth. In that world, compassion does not feed. Survival demands hardness, and the boy watched, always watched, who lied, who betrayed, who smiled while planning your fall. While others dreamed of honor, he understood something more important. Power is born from the control of fear. He was not educated in books. He was educated in betrayals. He was captured by a rival tribe, chained like an animal, exposed to public humiliation. The men laughed at him. They believed they had destroyed his future. But they did not understand what they were creating, because even in chains, the boy did not beg. He watched, he waited, he learned, and one night he escaped. It was not a heroic escape. It was silent, precise, calculated. That was the moment he stopped being a victim and began becoming something more dangerous. He returned to a divided world. Tribes facing each other for generations, endless vendettas, hatred inherited as if it were blood, all fought for scraps. No one thought of the whole. He did. He began from below. Without proclaiming himself leader, without demanding loyalty, first he helped, then he protected, then he rewarded, and when someone betrayed, there were no second chances. His message was clear. Loyalty would be rewarded and betrayal erased. Little by little, men tired of useless wars began to follow him, not out of love, not out of ideology, but because with him they survived. He broke the old rules. Lineage did not matter, tribe did not matter, ability mattered. The traditional leaders laughed at him. They called him a savage without heritage, a man without legitimacy. That was their second great mistake. Because while they argued over titles, he was building something new, a system where merit was worth more than blood, where punishment was swift and reward fair. The steppes began to change. Tribes that had been enemies swore loyalty to a single cause, not to a king, but to a vision. He did not speak of conquering the world. He spoke of order, of unity, of a future where no one would ever again die abandoned as he had been. But beneath those words, something darker was growing. Each victory reinforced his conviction that fear worked. Each betrayal confirmed his contempt for human weakness. Each defeated enemy carried him a little further from mercy. His followers saw in him a savior, his enemies an emerging demon. Both were right, because the boy who had once been abandoned on the steppes no longer sought to survive. He sought to dominate, and as his influence expanded, something inside him hardened. The pain of the past did not disappear, it transformed into ambition, into control, into a dangerous certainty. The world respects only strength. He still wore no crown, he still ruled no empire. But he had already crossed a point of no return. The rise had begun, and the world, without knowing it, was about to learn his name. Power does not arrive all at once. First it whispers, then it demands, and in the end it transforms. When the clans finally gathered under a single banner, the world needed a name to understand what was happening. And that name began to be repeated, first in low voices, then with fear. Temujin. That was the name of the man who had united the tribes that for centuries had only destroyed one another. For his followers, he was a necessary leader, For his enemies, an impossible threat to stop. But to himself, power was something new and dangerous. At first, Temujin ruled with a clear idea: order. He had seen too much chaos, too much betrayal, too much weakness. He believed only a firm hand could prevent the world from breaking again, and for a time it worked. Thefts decreased. Internal disputes ceased. Men knew exactly what happened if they disobeyed and what they gained if they were loyal. Fear became a tool, efficient, silent, but power never stays still. It always wants more. Temujin was proclaimed supreme leader. He was no longer only a tribal chief. He was something different, something greater. And with that new title came a new way of thinking. Before, he punished to maintain order. Now, he punished to set an example. A minor disobedience could end in a public execution. A suspicion of betrayal was enough to erase an entire family. Not because it was necessary, but because it was effective. His generals began to notice the change. The man who once listened now decided alone. The leader who once doubted now never questioned his own judgment. Each victory reinforced a dangerous idea. He was always right. And when someone is always right, he stops seeing people. He sees only obstacles. It was then he made the decision that would change everything. It was not enough to unite the steppes. The outside world was weak, divided, rich, and he knew it. The first campaigns were swift, brutal, precisely calculated. Cities that surrendered were spared. Those that resisted disappeared. No ruins remained. Warnings remained. The message spread faster than his armies. To surrender was to survive. To resist was to die. For many, Temujin was no longer only a leader. He was a force of nature. And like every unstoppable force, he began to justify himself. Every massacre had a reason. Every city destroyed, a logical explanation. Every death, a strategic necessity. This is how power changes a man. It does not make him cruel immediately. It makes him convinced. Convinced that the end justifies the means. Convinced that his vision is worth more than any life. Convinced that the world needs to be broken to be rebuilt. It was at this point that Temujin adopted a new name. One that did not belong to a man, but to an idea. Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. The punishment of the world, the chosen of destiny. That name was not only a title, it was armor. Behind it, the man disappeared, and the conqueror remained. Genghis Khan no longer saw blood. He saw results. He no longer heard screams. He heard submission. He no longer felt guilt. He felt control. His enemies called him a monster. His men called him law. Both were right. Because power does not destroy a man's humanity. It replaces it. And although his empire grew, something inside him began to empty. The betrayals of the past no longer hurt. Compassion no longer existed. Only a cold and dangerous certainty remained. The world belongs to the one who dares to take it. But history has a rule no conqueror can break. A rule power never mentions. The higher a man rises, the more violent his fall will be. And without knowing it, Genghis Khan had just crossed the point where power stops serving and begins to demand its price. Fear travels faster than any army, and now fear carried his name. Genghis Khan no longer needed to introduce himself. The stories arrived before he did. Stories whispered by merchants, refugees, and prisoners who managed to escape. Stories no one wanted to believe until it was too late. Entire cities vanished from the map. Not conquered, not occupied, erased. It was not chaos, it was method. Every act of cruelty had a clear purpose: to break the will before the war even began. Genghis Khan understood something few leaders before him had grasped so clearly. A terrified enemy is a defeated enemy. The first cities to resist were turned into examples. Walls did not matter. Armies did not matter. Plea for mercy did not matter either. When resistance fell, mercy vanished with it. Men executed publicly. Women and children taken as spoils. local leaders forced to witness the destruction of everything they ruled. It was not rage, it was calculation. Every survivor was released with a precise message. This is what happens when you say no. And the message worked. Cities opened their gates without fighting. Rulers handed over wealth, hostages, and oaths of loyalty without raising a sword. For many, submission seemed the only rational option, but even obedience had a price. Genghis Khan did not trust human memory. He trusted trauma. He ordered exemplary punishments even among those who surrendered. Not always, just enough so no one would forget who ruled. Cruelty became a silent constant, present even in peace. His generals carried out orders without questioning them. Not because they were sadistic, but because they had learned that questioning was dangerous. The empire grew like a shadow that could not be stopped. From the steppes to cities that had never heard of them, from mud villages to ancient centers of trade, and with each victory, violence became normalized. At first, some men hesitated. Then they stopped. Finally, they stopped feeling. Cruelty did not arrive as a monster. It arrived as routine. Genghis Khan justified every decision with relentless logic. Destruction prevented future rebellions. Terror saved lives in the long term. Brutality guaranteed stability. And perhaps, in a cold and mathematical sense, he was right. But something began to fracture. The same men who once followed him out of respect now followed him out of fear. Genuine loyalty was replaced by mechanical obedience. No one dared tell him he was wrong. No one dared warn him. Absolute power had removed the last obstacle, contradiction. Genghis Khan no longer saw individuals. He saw numbers, cities as variables, populations as problems to solve. And when a problem had no simple solution, it was eliminated. Even within his own empire, the atmosphere changed. Celebrations were silent, victories tense. Laughter disappeared, because no one knew when a poorly spoken word, a wrong glance, or a moment of doubt could become a death sentence. Cruelty was no longer a tool. It was the empire's identity. And although the world trembled at his name, something deeper was happening. The fear he had built was beginning to reflect back toward him. Genghis Khan slept little. He trusted few. He watched everyone. He knew he ruled over terrified men. And he knew what terrified men do when they believe they have a chance. The empire remained united, but not by conviction, by force. And history has shown again and again that empires built only on fear do not fall immediately. First, they crack. The seeds of collapse are not always planted with rebellion. Sometimes they are planted with silence, because when no one dares to speak, errors grow without control. Genghis Khan had created a world that functioned perfectly while he was present. A system that depended entirely on his will, his mind, and his terror. A system with no space for humanity. And although his power seemed infinite, cruelty had begun something irreversible. It had turned his empire into a machine that only knew how to destroy. The problem with machines is that they do not distinguish between enemy and creator. The era of cruelty had reached its peak. The world was subdued. Fear was law. But history never allows darkness to grow without consequence. And while the empire seemed invincible, the first signs of its fall were beginning to form in silence. The fall never announces its arrival. First, it hints. For years, the empire had advanced like a storm impossible to stop. Cities fell, kingdoms broke. The name of Genghis Khan was enough to close gates or open them in fear. But even the most violent storms begin to lose strength without anyone noticing. The first signs did not come from outside. They came from within. Genghis Khan was no longer the same man who had united the tribes. The body that once endured cold, hunger, and war now demanded rest. Nights grew longer, sleep shorter. Wounds took longer to close. Age did not take away his power. It took away his patience. And patience had been, without him knowing it, one of his most important weapons. He began to distrust even those closest to him. Generals who had fought beside him for decades were now watched with suspicion. A misinterpreted comment, a victory celebrated too openly, a loyalty that seemed ambition. The fear he had used to rule his enemies now began to seep into his own circle. Decisions became faster, harsher, less discussed. No one dared question him. And that silence began to cost dearly. Campaigns stretched farther and farther. Distances grew. Logistics became fragile. Keeping united an empire built on speed and terror required absolute precision. But errors began to accumulate. Some cities surrendered and were punished anyway. Some allies were treated as potential enemies. Some warnings were ignored, not because they were false, but because they came with doubt, and doubt was no longer tolerated. Within the empire, cruelty had eliminated something essential: honesty. Officers said what Genghis Khan wanted to hear, not what he needed to know. Reports were polished, problems minimized. The system worked until it didn't. Succession also became a constant shadow. Genghis Khan had sons, heirs, possible continuers of his legacy. But the empire he had built depended too much on a single figure. No one knew with certainty what would happen after him, and that uncertainty was dangerous. The heirs competed in silence. Internal alliances tightened, glances filled with calculation. Genghis Khan saw it, and he hated it. He had spent his life destroying divisions, and now he saw them reborn within his own house. He tried to control them with the same tool as always: fear. But fear no longer united as before. It only contained. Meanwhile, in the conquered territories, trauma did not disappear. Cities ruled by terror obeyed but did not forget. Every punishment had sown resentment. Every execution had left invisible scars. The empire was vast, too vast. And maintaining it required more than force. Genghis Khan had built a perfect machine for conquering, but an imperfect one for sustaining. A structure that depended on constant movement, continuous expansion, unbroken victories. And when expansion began to slow, the cracks became visible. Enemies learned. Tactics no longer surprised. Terror no longer paralyzed as before. The world was beginning to adapt. Genghis Khan knew it. He felt it in every decision that was no longer as simple as before, in every campaign that demanded more sacrifices for fewer results, in every sleepless night watching a map that seemed too large even for him. For the first time, control was not absolute, and that enraged him. He responded as always, with greater harshness. More punishments, more demands, but this time cruelty did not solve the problem. It only deepened it, because the true enemy was no longer outside the empire. It was in its design. An empire based on fear needs fear to be eternal, but fear wears out. And when it stops working, nothing remains to sustain it. Genghis Khan was still feared, still obeyed, still powerful. But something had changed. He no longer advanced with the certainty of before. He advanced with the urgency of one who knows time is running out. The signs of the fall were not cries or open rebellions. They were silences, delays, glances that turned away. They were small cracks in a structure too rigid to bend. The empire still stood, but it was no longer indestructible. And though the world still trembled at his name, history was beginning to prepare the final act. Because when power is based solely on fear, the fall does not come with a blow, it comes when that fear is no longer enough. The end rarely arrives with noise. Sometimes it arrives in silence. For decades, the world had revolved around a single name. A name that closed gates, halted armies, and made entire cities tremble. But even men who seem larger than history cannot escape a simple truth. The body always claims what power ignores. Genghis Khan still ruled, but no longer from absolute strength. His presence still commanded respect, but his energy had become irregular. There were days when his mind remained as sharp as ever, and others when fatigue weighed more than any armor. Campaigns continued, but something had changed. He no longer advanced from ambition. He advanced from habit. The empire was too vast to stop, too dependent on constant expansion. And Genghis Khan knew it. He knew that slowing meant weakening, that showing rest meant showing vulnerability. So he continued forward, even when the body no longer responded the same. Even when nights filled with pain, even when death began to feel close. Accounts of his final days do not fully agree. Some speak of illness, others of a fall, others of wounds that never healed. The exact truth was lost or concealed, and that was not an accident, because the man who had ruled through fear understood something else. An empire based on terror cannot allow its leader to die in an ordinary way. Death had to be controlled or erased. Genghis Khan continued giving orders even when he could no longer ride as before. He kept making decisions, though each seemed to cost him more effort. His generals watched him with a mixture of respect, fear, and something new, anticipation. The world he had built was now preparing for a future without him, and that future was uncertain. The heirs were ready, but divided. The empire was vast, but fragile. The structure that had functioned under a single will began to strain at the idea of multiple hands trying to control it. Genghis Khan perceived it, and he hated it. He had not spent his life destroying kingdoms so that his own would slowly crumble. He would not allow his legacy to dissolve into internal disputes, weakness, or selective memory. So he did what he had always done: control, even the end. When death finally came, there was no public announcement, no immediate mourning, no confirmation. The world knew nothing for a time that felt endless, because silence was necessary. The empire continued functioning as if nothing had happened. Orders were transmitted. Campaigns continued. Fear remained intact. For a brief moment, Genghis Khan seemed immortal. But truth cannot be hidden forever. When it finally became known that he had died, the impact was deep. It was not an explosion. It was a crack that slowly ran through the entire structure of the empire. Enemies celebrated in secret. Allies remained silent. Heirs began to move. The man who had held everything together was no longer there, and without him, the system showed its fragility. The end of Genghis Khan was not a final great battle. It was not a public defeat. It was not humiliation. It was something far more unsettling. It was the end of a presence, an impossible void to fill. Because he had built an empire that depended too much on his fear, his mind, and his will, and none of those things could be fully inherited. His final orders were clear. His death was to remain hidden, his tomb unknown, his body returned to the earth without marks or monuments, no statues, no mausoleums, no place for physical remembrance, only legend. The most feared conqueror in the world disappeared without leaving a trace. And perhaps, in that final act, he revealed the last contradiction of his life. The man who had wanted to dominate the entire world chose to disappear from it. But although his body was lost, the consequences of his reign remained. Cities destroyed, cultures altered, borders redefined, generations marked by trauma and fear. The empire continued to exist. But it was no longer the same, because terror without its creator begins to decompose. The end had arrived, not with cries, not with fire, but with silence. And while the world tried to understand what had truly happened, one final question remained suspended in the air. Had Genghis Khan been the architect of an eternal empire, or simply the first step toward its inevitable fall? History seemed to have ended. The conqueror had died. Fear began to fade. But the real turning point was not in his death. It was in what remained after. For years, the world had reduced Genghis Khan to a single image: destruction, fire, blood, terror. And that image was not false, it was incomplete. Because when the noise of battles faded, something unexpected began to become visible beneath the ruins. The empire did not immediately disintegrate. It did not collapse into total chaos. It did not fragment again as many had expected. Instead, it transformed. The same men who had conquered through fear began to govern in a different way, not from sudden compassion but from necessity. They had inherited an immense, diverse territory, impossible to control through constant violence alone. And so, without announcement, the change occurred. Trade routes reopened. Messengers crossed continents without being attacked. Laws began to be applied uniformly, regardless of tribe, religion, or origin. Something that had seemed unthinkable under a reign of terror began to take shape: functional order. The system Genghis Khan had created for war proved surprisingly effective for administration. The same networks that transported armies now moved information. The same rigid hierarchies that punished disobedience now guaranteed stability. Fear had built the structure. But the structure survived fear. And there was the turning point. Because although Genghis Khan ruled with cruelty, he introduced ideas the world had never seen at that scale. Meritocracy replaced, in many cases, lineage. Men rose by ability, not by blood. Religion, something rarely tolerated in previous empires, was permitted so long as it did not threaten order. For many conquered peoples, life under the empire was brutal at first but stable afterward. Internal wars diminished. Trade routes flourished. Cultural exchange accelerated. The same man who had destroyed cities had, without intending it, connected continents. And that unsettled history, because history prefers simple villains, monsters without nuance, clear endings. But reality rarely cooperates. The unexpected turn is not that Genghis Khan was good. He was not. It is that his legacy was not only destruction, it was contradiction. The terror he imposed allowed a peace others never achieved. The violence he unleashed opened paths that had not existed before. The empire built on fear ended up facilitating one of the greatest exchanges of ideas, technology, and trade in history. None of that justifies the suffering. None of that erases the massacres. None of that redeems the cruelty. But it explains something unsettling. The modern world was shaped in part by a man who ruled without mercy. That is the uncomfortable turn. That absolute evil rarely produces simple consequences. That even the most brutal regimes leave complex traces. That history does not reward or punish with moral justice. It only records outcomes. Genghis Khan did not seek to create a better world. He sought control. He sought security. He sought that no one would ever abandon him again. And in doing so, he changed the course of history more than many heroes ever did. His tomb remains lost. His death remains a mystery. But his influence is everywhere, in trade routes, in borders, in ideas of governance, in the flow of cultures between East and West. The final turn is not that he was remembered. It is that, despite everything, he could not be ignored. And perhaps that is the darkest lesson of all. That power based on cruelty can fail morally and still succeed historically. That the world does not always learn from justice. Sometimes it learns from fear. Genghis Khan fell. His empire changed. But the echo of his reign still resonates centuries later, not as a clear warning, not as an example to follow, but as an uncomfortable question history never fully answers. Do the ends justify the means when the means change the world forever? Empires built on fear don't disappear, they evolve. The pattern repeats in different times, different worlds, and sometimes on a scale the world has never seen before. If you want to see what that looks like, watch Stalingrad. And if you want more stories like this, like, subscribe, and share.